Okay.
Yeah, works for me now.
Okay.
And Zoe.
Still doesn't work for me.
Yep. Now it should work.
There we go. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Okay, are we ready to go in, or do we want to wait another? Let's wait till 9.
Could just do it right on the hour.
Yeah. And I'll give it like a few seconds so that everyone can trickle in. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give it about a minute to let all the attendees trickle in. All right, I think everyone is in at this point. So hello and welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, and thank you for coming to our panel, Coexisting with Wolves in the Midst of Climate Change. My name is Megan Sristi, and I am a Land or Water co-director this year, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. And I just have a few announcements before we get started. For starters, I have a tech warning. If you're an attendee, don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with video off. And so you will only be able to see the panelists. We cannot see you. Throughout the panel, if you have a question, please save it for the end. We have time set aside for a Q&A. So just use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. And all of our panelists will be happy to answer the questions at the end of the session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience and you're looking to earn some CLE credits for this panel, I'm going to be dropping a link to our JOT form. That way you can register and make sure you get those credits. So just be on the lookout for that in the Q&A in a few minutes. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land or Water, or otherwise known as FLAW, helps to provide stipends for students who are doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships during the summer. And if you're interested in making a donation to help provide these students with stipends, information to make a donation will be on a Google document that will also be dropped in the chat by me, so look out for that. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ili, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at the University of Oregon and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. POC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. And I will now introduce our panelists. Dr. Sristi Kamal is a senior representative for Defenders of Wildlife and is based out of Portland, Oregon. Dr. Kamal has a PhD in ecology, and her academic background focused on the human dimensions of wildlife conservation. Dr. Kamal works with local partners, agencies, and at the legislature to secure better policies for wildlife in Oregon. Her portfolio in Oregon includes imperiled species such as the gray wolf, marbled murrelet, and southern resident orcas, as well as supporting ecological connectivity work, anti-poaching efforts, and agency commission reform. And then we have Dr. Zoe Hanley is a Northwest representative for Defenders of Wildlife based out of White Salmon, Washington. Dr. Hanley has a PhD in environmental and natural resources sciences and has spent her career working on large and meso-carnivore conservation. She leads Defenders Coexistence initiatives in the Pacific Northwest, working directly with agencies and communities who influence recovery of and share the landscape with grizzly bears and gray wolves. Dr. Hanley's portfolio includes promoting methods to reduce human-carnivore conflict through scientific inquiry, education programming, and state-level policy work. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it off to our panelists to get started on the presentation.
Thank you so much, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sristi Kamal, and as Megan mentioned, I'm the Senior Representative at Defenders of Wildlife. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon, which is the traditional lands of Molalla, Cowlitz, Multnomah, bands of Chinook, and many other tribes that call the banks of the Columbia River their home. Our presentation today will focus on coexisting with carnivores, specifically coexisting with wolves in the midst of climate change. In my part of the presentation, I'll talk more about the status of wolves in Oregon, what are our management approaches, what are some of the recent challenges we've faced in wolf management in Oregon, and then in Zoe's part of her presentation, she'll deep dive into climate change impacts on wolves and how we can navigate and coexist with wolves under those impacts. So let's start with what we mean by coexistence with carnivores to begin with. In Defenders' philosophy, coexistence with carnivores is the ability of both humans and carnivores to share a landscape and benefit from it, so that one does not impede the other's ability to live, survive, and thrive. So with that philosophy, we work on the ground a lot with local communities to mitigate human-livestock conflicts. So let's start by taking a quick look at wolf population in Oregon, a quick stat and overview. I will start with a caveat that Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife does an annual wolf count during the winter every year. So we are due for a report sometime next month. So all of these stats might actually be stale in another month, but this is what we have in terms of data right now. So as at the end of 2020, Oregon had 173 wolves at least. These are wolves that ODFNW counts physically during winter, so through aerial counts and other methods. That marks a 9.5% increase from our 2019 documented wolf population. And in Oregon, a wolf pack is defined as 4 or more wolves traveling together in the winter. Again, winter because ODFNW does the count in the winter. At the end of 2020, we had 22 packs in the state in 12 counties. 17 of those packs met the criteria as breeding pairs, and 7 more were groups, or groups meaning they're less than 4 individuals traveling together. So either 2 or 3 wolves that were traveling together. So that's why they're termed as groups. Looking at the broad population trends in Oregon from 2009, when they were first documented, all the way up till 2020, we see a slow but steady increase in wolf population, as well as the number of packs and breeding pairs. There sometimes is a misconception that wolves were reintroduced in Oregon. That is not true. They made it back on their own through Idaho. And so this is not a reintroduced population in Oregon, but wolves kind of reclaiming their historical suitable habitats. If you look at Oregon's maps and where wolves are, you can see that most of our wolf packs are concentrated in the northeastern corner of our state. On the west side, we only have 2 packs. All the other 20 are on the east side of the state. Oregon Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has a guiding document called the Wolf Conservation and Management Plan, based on which they manage wolves in our state. And based on that wolf plan, the state of Oregon is divided into 2 wolf management zones. You can see the red line that divides the state into 2 zones. East of that is East Management Zone and west is West Management Zone. So as you can see, we have almost all of our wolves on the East Management Zone side. So let's talk more about these management zones and how it relates to our federal listing of wolves. If you look at this map, the red line is the division of the state based on the wolf plan. So that's the East Management Zone and the West Management Zone. That's, however, different from the federal delineation line for the federal listing of wolves under federal ESA, or Endangered Species Act. So that blue dotted line marks the boundary for our federal listing status. East of that line, wolves have not been federally listed since 2011. West of that blue line is what wolves have in terms of federal protection in our state. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about the recent changes in our federal listing for wolves a little later. But these are kind of our management zone boundaries, if you will. So as I mentioned in the wolf plan, we have the state divided into management zones. Now for each zone, ODF&W assesses a management phase. And we have 3 management phases. Phase 1 applies until the population reaches 4 or more breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. Phase 2 is kind of an intermediate between phase 1 and phase 3. And phase 3 occurs when wolf population have reached at least 7 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. So when you look at the management zones, which is the red line, east of the red line has been under phase 3 for a little while. West of the red line, we have wolves in phase 1. Why these phases are important? Because if you look from phase 1 all the way to phase 3, there's decreasing level of protection for wolves. There's also sort of more lax standards for chronic depredation, which is when ODF&W can engage in lethal control of wolves. So the management phases are very important for wolf management in Oregon. So let's talk about the federal status and its implication on Oregon's wolves. As I mentioned, back in 2011, we lost federal status for wolves east of the blue line because they were considered part of the same population or distinct population segment or DPS as the wolves in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. So they're the Rocky Mountain distinct population segment. And they were delisted back in 2011 by US Fish and Wildlife Service. West of that line, the wolves continue to enjoy federal protections. But under Trump administration, the US Fish and Wildlife Service in 2020 delisted wolves from federal ESA. This was followed by a lawsuit by several conservation groups, including defenders, against this decision. The court procedures went on for 2 years, and as recent as this month, early this month, the court actually ruled in favor of conservation groups, that is us, and reinstated the protections for wolves in the western 2/3 of our state, or generally for the whole country, but in our case, it applies to the western 2/3 of our state. So our wolves on the west of that blue dotted line are back to having federal protections. But what does that mean for most of our wolves? If you compare the 2 maps, you will see that, again, a lot of our wolves are actually east of that blue dotted line. So a lot of our wolves and wolf packs actually still do not enjoy any level of protections under federal ESA. So this still remains a matter of concern for us, and why I'll just clarify here, because besides federal ESA, we also have the State Endangered Species Act, but wolves have been delisted from the federal State Endangered Species Act since 2015. So without federal ESA and without state ESA, the wolves on the east side of our state actually have no protections under any sort of law. The only guiding document for wolf management, as I mentioned, is the wolf plan, and that's all we have for the eastern population of our state. So this wolf plan dictates, amongst other things, what defines as a chronic depredation standard. So in phase 1 in our state, the chronic depredation standard is 4 instances in 6 months. So for the western part of our state, that's the status. But as I mentioned, because they're under federal listing, this does not actually apply. The federal ESA trumps this. So this 4 instances in 6 months in phase 1 for the western part of our state is not really applicable at this time. But for the eastern part of our state, which is in phase 3, the chronic depredation standard is 2 instances in 9 months. According to us, that's a really poor standard and not based in any scientific evidence. 2 instances of any event within 9 months cannot be considered chronic. You can think of any example in your own life. If you have a cold twice in 9 months, you will not say you have chronic cold, you suffer from chronic cold. So this is a really, really poor and weak standard according to us, and we would like to improve on it during the revision of the wolf plan. The wolf plan is revised every 5 years, and the last iteration we have is from 2019. This chronic depredation standard allows ODF&W to engage in lethal control, which means they can actively go and kill wolves or wolf packs if the chronic depredation standard is met, and if they can verify that landowners have engaged in some level of non-lethal measures. But we strongly believe that science has shown that lethal control seldom acts as a long-term solution. It can fix the problem temporarily, but it is never going to be a long-term solution, and it can cause more and more conflict if done the wrong way. Another key factor to remember when you're thinking about lethal control in case of wolves is that wolves are very social and complex creatures, in the sense they live in complex pack structures, and who you remove from the pack has significant impact on the pack dynamic, whether it's the breeder male, the breeder female, a yearling who's an efficient hunter. Depends on who you remove from the pack. It can either cause the pack to dissociate and lead to more conflict. It can deteriorate the quality of the pack's ability to hunt. So there is a lot of implications, and therefore we also strongly believe that lethal control does not do much for wolves at all. So let's look at where wolf monitoring, depredation, and mortalities have been in recent times. As I mentioned, we don't have the population count for 2021, but we do have depredation counts because they are reported instantly, so they are kind of live information. Same goes for mortalities that are human caused. So in our state, at the end of 2020, we had 47 radio-collared wolves, of which 21 were captured in 2020 and radio-collared. Those collars have a lifespan, so they need to do this continuously every year when they do their annual population monitoring or count. If you look at depredations, we've had significantly low depredation all the way till 2020, when the first sort of significant level of depredation was reached when we had 31 confirmed wolf depredations in the state. And these are not instances, but actually number of livestock that were predated on. And in 2020, of this 31, more than 50% was actually caused by one particular pack, and that was the rogue pack that is in the southwest part of our state. And in 2021, we have between 90 to 100 depredations, of which 50 were cattle. Again, another significant leap here. In this case, again, we saw some packs engage more in predations than others, specifically the Lookout Mountain pack and OR30 group of wolves. And towards the end, we also had the Lassen male, LAS M13, who made it to Oregon, who also engaged a little bit in depredation in Southwest Oregon. So it's kind of a couple of repeated depredations by a few group of wolves, and then we had a few isolated incidences as well. In terms of mortality, in 2020, we had 9 wolf mortalities, of which 7 were human caused. And of these 7, 4 were actually poached. If you look at 2021, that number should be 18 and not 17. Sorry, but we have 18 human-caused wolf mortalities, of which 10 were poached in Oregon, and 8 were further killed by ODF&W in response to depredation. So we'll dive a little bit into these particular wolf mortalities right now. So as I mentioned here, poaching has become a serious threat for wolf recovery in Oregon. We have had loss of wolves to poaching more than even lethal control in the last 2 years. And in 2021, it was especially a grim situation. We have never seen this level of poaching, or at least documented poaching of wolves in a year. We had 8 wolves poisoned in Union County between February and July. This included the Catherine pack in Union County, in which all 5 members were found poisoned together, and that led to the whole pack being wiped out. In addition to that, we had 3 separate instances of poisoning that made the total count up to 8 in Union County. Then early this year, we've again had another wolf found shot by the roadside in Wallowa County in January. And then as recent as last week, we had another case of wolf being shot in Union County, found by a civilian. So this has brought a serious threat to wolves recovery in our state, because as I mentioned earlier, our recovery rate is only modest. The increase is somewhere between 7 to 10 or 11% on any given year. So removing this many individuals when we have only 173 wolves has serious consequences for wolves. So let's look at the implication of these kind of actions on wolf population in Oregon. As I mentioned, one thing that is important to note here is that in each of these poaching incidences, ODFNW and OSP, or Oregon State Police, discovered these wolves either because of a collar or because civilians notified them. But in each case of discovered poaching, the wolf either had a collar on its neck or there was a collar present in the pack, which was the case of the Catherine pack, which is why they were discovered. And as I mentioned earlier, we only have a few collars in all of the wolves that we have in our state. So the chances that every wolf that's poached is collared is very low. So you can only consider that as an indication of how many might have gone undiscovered. And 10 wolves were poached and 8 were killed by ODFNW, which brings the total count to at least 18 wolves being dead in 2021 by human causes, and not counting other natural deaths and highway collisions and that kind of data that ODFNW will be able to produce next month. We know that at least that means 10% of the population was affected. This is a huge setback to the population's ability to reclaim new territories, especially, as I mentioned, our western side of our state has very few wolf population, and the eastern side of our state is going to feed into the western side. So such act against wolves in the eastern side has serious implications on wolves' ability to reclaim territory on the western side of our state. The next main factor that led to wolf deaths, human-caused deaths, was wolf livestock conflicts. Again, as I mentioned earlier, 2021 saw more than average wolf livestock conflict in Oregon than we have in the recent past. And of those conflicts, 2 packs led to several lethal permits. This was also the year when we saw the highest number of lethal permits being issued by ODFNW. Lethal permits are basically authorization by ODFNW to either engage in lethal control themselves or to deputize affected producers to take a certain number of wolves. So in 2021, what we saw was that most of the lethal permits were for Lookout Mountain pack and for OR30 wolves. And in case of OR30 wolves, these lethal control permits were for producers and they did not actually kill any wolves, so it didn't lead to any lethal control on OR30 wolves. But in case of Lookout Mountain pack, the situation got really dire. So I'll use the example of the Lookout Mountain pack, therefore. The Lookout Mountain pack is located in Baker County. If you look at the map, the bottommost right label is the Lookout Mountain pack. On the right-hand side, the bottom label is the Lookout Mountain pack. And so this pack started in April of 2021 with 11 members. They had a really successful litter. They produced 7 pups, and then they had 2 yearlings from the year before staying with them, and the breeding pair, of course. So this was the size of the pack in April 2021. Then into spring and summer, we saw 11 instances of depredations that this particular pack engaged in. In some of these instances that led to the death of livestock. In some cases, it led to injuries. Because of these instances, repeated lethal control permits were issued by ODFNW. And they started with lethal control on pups. So the first lethal control actually led to the killing of 2 pups. Following that, there were incremental killing by ODFNW over time. And so that led to the total number of deaths to 8 wolves by the end of the year, including the breeder male. So what is left in the pack is basically the breeder female, 1 yearling, and a pup. So they have 3 individuals left in the pack, a pack that started with 11 members. This has been one of the most difficult and painful thing to witness for us. This was a really complicated situation, and this pack actually sets the ground for our discussion today on the climate change impacts on carnivores and how that plays out on the ground. So in case of Lookout Mountain pack, ODFNW, as I mentioned, engaged in incremental killing of the pack. And while that stopped predations for a short while, it inevitably came back. So this is a classic example. In fact, Lookout Mountain pack makes a good example of why lethal control is never a long-term solution. That exploring non-lethal alternatives, understanding and implementing grazing practices that are complementary in being able to coexist with carnivores on landscape should be a priority. It is difficult to mitigate conflict once it has started. It is much easier to prevent conflict in the first place. So proactive non-lethal measures is something that we strongly advocate for, and you'll hear a lot about that from Zoe. The other factor was that, and Zoe will go deeper into this part, but there are examples and evidences from the ground that drought, the drought that we faced last year and the summer temperatures, the rising summer temperatures, may have influenced how this pack behaved and how this pack moved or refused to move from that area. So there are impacts of climate change, and that impact changes animal behavior, but our wolf plan does not allow for any contingency in our management and our approach to wolf conservation. So while we recognize that climate change impacts carnivores in our wolf plan, there is no provision for adjusting any standard for chronic depredation or how you engage in lethal control as a result of that. So that is something in terms of policy that we really need to deep dive into. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zoe to share her part of the presentation, but I would love to engage further in a discussion with everyone here. And my email address is here, so please do feel free to write to me if you have any questions beyond this discussion today. So with that, I'm handing it to you, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Sristi. Let me bring up my screen here, and then I'll do just a brief introduction of myself. So hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. Again, my name is Zoe Hanley, and I currently, as Megan said, I live outside of White Salmon, Washington. And so right now I live and work on ceded lands of the Yakima Nation, who have lived here since time immemorial, and those tribes still continue to steward these lands today. So I'm going to take a bit of a step back and widen our scope to talking about the climate change impacts on carnivores worldwide. And then, as Sristi mentioned, zoom back in to talk about the recent example with the Lookout Mountain pack that we experienced in 2021 in regards to wolf livestock conflict. So 3 of the primary drivers of climate change impacts on carnivores globally, and these are certainly not only impacts on carnivores, most animal and plant species, tens of thousands, are experiencing these 3 issues as well. But one of the primary ones is shrinking habitat and disruption of habitat. The second one are range shifts in their geographic range. And so in response to warming temperatures, many species are either moving upslope in terms of moving higher in elevation, or they're moving poleward. So either towards the north or the south poles, away from the equator where it's still cooler. There's also reduced resource availability. So things such as food and water. And so the example that I'm providing here is that of cheetahs in sub-Saharan Africa, which are currently experiencing 2 of these 3 shifts. So shrinking and disruption of habitat, and also reduced resource availability, primarily due to habitat fragmentation, human encroachment on wildlands, and also the bushmeat trade and livestock, which are many times there's a higher livestock density in some of these wildland areas that aren't protected national parks than there are native prey species that cheetahs would normally eat. And so things like that increase human carnivore conflict. And I'm going to use an example of drought, again, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, but then moving us back to the US, and how drought creates additional opportunities for human carnivore conflict above what we would normally, even just from, human population expansion and activity in wildland areas alone. And so an example from 2020 is drought igniting human wildlife conflict in Zimbabwe, when there was so little rain that watering holes were distributed, every 20 to 50 miles. And there were many, many species, domestic and wild, that were only able to use these very small watering holes. And so you had everything you can see here, from elephants to lions to domestic cattle, all around the same watering hole. And because of the competition between species and the opportunities provided by that close interaction between wild animals and domestic livestock, that increased conflicts with the ranchers and the herders that were managing those livestock, who oftentimes everything from elephants to lions, so that their livestock could live and drink at some of these watering holes. An example in North America that happened just this past summer following the heat dome that we experienced in the Western United States was increased conflicts between black bears and grizzly bears and humans. And some of that had to do with the reduction in huckleberry crop. So after we had the heat dome, those plants didn't get enough water and they shriveled. Some of the berries that were starting to develop and would have been available in late July and into August didn't come to fruition. And so that vital food source for bears wasn't available, which led them to come more into campsites and try to get food off of people's grills and out of their cars, and then also closer to homes where there's such caloric rich foods like birdseed and like human trash. And so the incidences and calls that wildlife managers received this past summer following the heat dome for bear-related conflicts was relatively high than what it's been in previous years. And so moving back into our Oregon wolf examples, let's just look at what the drought conditions were last year and also in 2020 as compared to the last decade, really. And so here's an image from the drought monitor that is often used as a metric for what drought conditions are statewide and even nationwide that are 5 years apart. So looking at August 16th in 2016 versus August 16th in 2021, you can see that last year, the vast majority of the state by mid-August was either in severe to extreme drought conditions. And 2 of the packs that Sristi had been talking about, the Lookout Mountain Pack and the Rogue Pack from southwestern Oregon, were experiencing various levels of drought, usually oscillating on that severe to extreme range in 2021. So how did that influence wolf livestock conflict for both of those packs? To go back to 2020, as Sristi mentioned, for the Rogue Pack, that was a year of high depredations for that pack. So there were over 10 depredations by the Rogue Pack, the highest in the state for that year. And thankfully, no wolves were killed because at that time, and as Sristi mentioned currently today, that portion of Oregon is still federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. However, in 2021, that pack that had had very high depredations the previous year, but wasn't subject to any lethal control, had 0 depredations for the vast majority of the summer until they had 1 or 2 in November, after most of the drought conditions had passed. And one of the reasons for that is that they had the in their pack territory. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but they had the opportunity to move outside of this pastured, this low-lying pastured landscape where most of the depredations had occurred, to some higher elevation forested areas that were likely cooler, that still had a relatively high prey base. And they spent the summer up there where there was pretty much low human activity and where there were no cattle. And so the drought conditions had them, that pack, change their behavior in a way that actually brought them further from human conflict, rather than closer to it. And that was not the case with the Lookout Mountain Pack. So again, the Lookout Mountain Pack in 2020 had 0 depredations. That pack had no history of conflicts with livestock until 2021. Which again was an extreme drought year. And that year they had more than 10 depredations. As Sristi mentioned, 8 of those wolves were killed. And one of the things that's a little bit different here is that they did not have an opportunity within their pack territory to move to anywhere that is outside of this shrubland and cropland landscape, to move higher in elevation or to a forested area. Where there would be lower cattle density and lower human activity. And so they spent their entire summer in a relatively hot, dry area that was rich with both domestic cattle, but also species like elk. There's a large elk herd right there in Baker County, which is probably one of the reasons why that pack chose that area to den in the first place. And so, among many factors, those drought conditions really led the Lookout Mountain Pack to spend a lot of time in an area where they were going to be prone to human-carnivore conflict. And one of the other things that was very interesting to note, not only for the Lookout Mountain Pack, but across many states, we were hearing that wolves were spending more time in one area than they ever had before during the summer season. And so most of the time, wolves den in an area and they spend, three or so months there with the pups. And then when the pups are large enough to travel, they start moving to what are called rendezvous sites. And so these are like some portable pup living rooms that are just safe spaces that have food and play items. And so when the pups can travel, the pack will move from the den and move, a quarter of a mile away and stay there for a week. And then they'll move another half mile away from there and then a mile. And they'll start slowly moving more and more throughout their pack territory as the summer goes on. That wasn't the case with the Lookout Mountain Pack and with other packs. They denned right in that spot, right on near private property where the livestock incidences were occurring. And they stayed there for the vast majority of the summer, which is one of the reasons why depredations were so high, because usually they're just cyclical and then the pack will move somewhere else and there'll be an ebb and flow to any kind of livestock interaction. And that just wasn't the case this year. And I think one of the primary drivers of that was that there was water availability and there was food availability there for these wolves, both in the form of primarily elk. They were still mostly eating elk for the majority of the summertime, but they did at some point tend to prefer cattle and start increasingly eating cattle more and more and more, which is so detrimental to the perception of wolf recovery in the state and clearly for that pack. And so one of the things that come up in conversations with livestock producers saying, so why, if there were elk there, right there, you could be standing in a pasture with one of the dead cows that the wolves had killed, and you could look over on the other hillside and see the herd of elk. They said, why are these wolves coming over and killing these cows when their natural prey source is right there? And so I want to show a quick video to illustrate one of the reasons why that may be the case. So what we just saw there, oh, let me get my right screen back up here. So what we just saw there was that while that elk mother was defending her calf, and so even though the wolves initially were able to chase after that female, she turned around and actually faced them and started to run towards them and scare them away from where her calf was bedded down. And that kind of activity that elk exhibit and that bison exhibit, so some of their natural prey can exhibit to actually defend their prey and themselves against wolves, is what keeps wolves thinking that cattle and sheep may be an easier opportunity for them. Because most often adult cows, heifers, the mothers, will actually turn and run and even leave the calves behind, which makes it very easy and low risk for wolves to get that prey source. And so let's talk about, given all of these challenges and how drought and climate change has the opportunity to exacerbate human-carnivore conflict, let's talk about ways that we can try to reduce it. And so some of you may already know of some of the tools that we have in what we call our non-lethal toolkit to reduce wolf livestock conflict and just predator livestock conflict in general. And so these tools include everything from barriers, either fortified physical fences, to what we call kind of pseudo fencing. This red flagging on the polywire is called fladry. And that's not a true barrier, but you have an opportunity to electrify that polywire. And there's these waving red flags, and the wolves really don't like that. They see it as a barrier and as something that they don't understand, and so they don't want to cross it. We have scare devices. This is a radio activated guard box sitting here that emits light and sound when a radio collared wolf comes into proximity of it. It scares them away. We have human presence. So both people sitting out and doing night watch around small pastures, shepherds spending the nighttime around sheep, everything to on large landscapes, having people on horseback, what we call range riders, spending time with the cows and hazing wolves and other predators away if they're nearby. We have livestock guardian animals. So this is a llama in with some sheep. There's also, most often, it's guardian dogs that are used with sheep. And in conjunction with night penning, livestock guardian animals, and human presence, we can nearly reduce sheep depredations to zero. We also have hazing techniques, like I mentioned, that are all often paired with human presence. And that's everything from air horns to people shooting guns in the air. And then really one of the very, very important ones is reducing attractants to large carnivores in the first place. And so what this is showing right here, and so in the context of livestock, many of those attractants are in the form of bone piles and livestock carcasses that are left on the landscape or in pits. And so the opportunities here are to either burn it, to bury it, or to compost it. And so what you can see here is a compost pile for livestock that is fenced off, so predators don't get a reward if they come to the area. But really we need to, all of those non-lethal tools are always going to be in the toolbox, and they're extremely helpful at this time. But if we actually want to start moving towards tools that can reduce human-carnivore conflict in addition to mitigating climate impacts on the landscape, we really need to expand beyond the non-lethal toolkit that we currently have to things like regenerative agriculture practices. And so this is an area of study that's relatively new. It's currently being adopted. The science is starting to catch up with the idea that we can use different livestock management practices, such as bunching, which I'll talk about in a minute, that to not only rekindle the herd instinct in those cows and have them start to act more like wild species, to turn and face like bison would, to maybe to stay with their calves or put their calves behind them and address the predator. And when we pair those livestock management opportunities in that, have an opportunity to reduce human-carnivore conflict, they also have an opportunity to reduce the negative impacts of livestock grazing on the landscape. And so by rekindling the herd instinct and teaching those cows to move in a way that's more similar to what bison would do, they're grazing for less time in a specific area, and they're moving as a smaller group more often. Because right now, livestock are generally encouraged on large landscapes to just spread out on the landscape, and they're there for about 6 months at a time, which can be pretty detrimental to the landscape, to soil impaction, and to the stubble height of the grass that doesn't allow them to regenerate. And so rekindling that herd instinct and asking them to group up in small groups and move regularly throughout the landscape better mirrors natural processes and what some of those wild species are doing to really maintain. And so in terms of addressing climate impacts, that really offers an opportunity to maintain moisture in the soil and to ensure that there's less erosion and an opportunity for those grasses to regenerate. And so this is really exciting because there are some researchers and some livestock communities, such as the Western Landowners Alliance, that are starting to pick this up and talk about the ability to pair regenerative agriculture with reducing wolf livestock conflict. So here's another few that are doing this as well. And so here's a picture of bison that you can see where these animals are starting to group up, and they're keeping the calves right next to them, which is one of the things that I'm talking about. But one of the things that we really need is for the livestock industry and federal and state land managers to actually promote and adopt these practices in a much more holistic way. So this is an example letter of a group of conservation groups, all the way to Cattlemen's Association, to livestock and public lands groups, writing a letter to the Bureau of Land Management requesting that they make revisions to their grazing practices that support regenerative agriculture. And so we need a lot more of this. We need to keep pushing those federal and state land managers to do this, both to reduce the climate impacts of livestock grazing on the landscape, and also to reduce human-carnivore conflict as well. And so Defenders is one of the organizations that is starting to do just that. So to conclude, climate change is an immediate and a pressing concern for all of us. But we really have an opportunity to reduce those impacts on both wildlife and human communities today, and we will continue to into the future. It's never too late for us to make those shifts. So also, better socio-ecological outcomes can arise when different human communities from different backgrounds are able to work together to address a challenge, and also when those solutions that we can come up with mirror natural processes, as I just explained. Traditional standards and responses to carnivore livestock conflict, which Sristi primarily talked about in the form of lethal control, won't be efficient because they don't factor in climate change impacts on carnivores. So management strategies in carnivore livestock conflict really need to be contingent on that species' reaction to climate change in their behavior, in their habitat use, and resource availability, instead of resorting to some of those conventional management methods like lethal control. And so here's a few resources that I would be able to share with the facilitators after this if you were interested, based on what I talked about today. And we are happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We have about 6 minutes set aside for the Q&A portion of the panel. The Q&A function is not working currently, so if you could just email your questions to askpilk, ASK, PIELC, @gmail.com. We will happily, I'll see them through the email and then I'll ask the panelists. But I do have a question already from Molly via the Ask Pilk Gmail. She wanted to know, while recognizing the problems you discussed require widespread solutions, is there anything that people at home at the individual level could do to protect wolves, like people besides ranchers and people who own cattle?
You can take that, Sristi.
Sure, thank you. I think in terms of everyday citizen engaging in this issue, I think advocacy is a huge component that we're missing when it comes to making our voices heard on what's important to Oregonians, and that wolf conservation is an important issue to Oregonians. That is really, really helpful for us to further ask for better policies, better management strategies. So if there is an opportunity for you to engage in any of the decision-making process, and most of these are public events, so I do want to highlight that. And most of these decisions are made at Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission meetings, and they're all public meetings. So I highly recommend engaging on those issues on that front. Then of course, spreading the word, as Zoe mentioned, you know, like while we who are deep in the trenches on this issue consider, you know, our toolkit as something that we all know, it's not necessarily true for people who are not deeply entrenched in this issue to be even aware that there are alternatives. There are things you can do more proactively. So spreading the word obviously also helps. To that, Zoe, if you'd like to add more, I can pass it on to you.
Yeah, I think that was excellent. I mean, like Sristi said, the opportunities to incorporate the use of non-lethals more into just our public narrative, whether it's in rural or urban communities, and also to increase the use of and the standardization of and the requirement of these tools in policy is really the direction that we need to go in, especially in the face of climate change.
Megan, I don't know whether you see it, but I see a hand raise in the attendees list from someone, and I don't know if they want to go off mute and ask a question, but I see a hand raise.
Yeah, we're just having people go through the email just for like safety reasons. So Julius, if you have a question, please email us at askpilk@gmail.com. But I do have another question from the email. Do you have any examples of human-carnivore conflicts in other areas of the US that are also affected by climate change impacts? Given that like this conference is remote this year, I think we have people from all over the country, which is really exciting. So if you have any other examples to share, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that black bear one was a pretty pivotal one for this past year, just in terms of any time that higher temperatures or drought reduces a food source opportunity for the animals that they would have otherwise in a natural system, that just automatically is going to widen where those animals go to look for food sources in other areas. And so I don't have another example offhand besides the one that I already gave around black bears and grizzlies. But that one's just so forefront in my mind right now because it really was a challenge throughout the Western United States and maybe even in the Eastern United States too, when there's years where oak crops are lower, where acorn crops aren't able to propagate because of drought. that always leads to black bears coming into human communities. And so when there's ever an opportunity for humans to reduce our attractants around the home, you know, that's not only an imperative for rural communities and livestock owners, it's really incumbent on all of us to be reducing any kind of attractant so that we can be responsible stewards of that landscape. And so when it comes to black bears and grizzly bears, that's really all about keeping your garbage secured and also reducing dog food being put outside and bird seed being put outside during the summertime when bears are out of the den.
Perfect. And then I have Julius's question. He asked, why not ranch bison? And if you could keep the answer to be 2 minutes, because we have to log off at 9:56 to give enough time for the next panel, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, Julius, that's an excellent question, and one that we've all thought about. I mean, to be brief, ranching bison would be great. Some producers have already switched over to it. I don't know if it fits into, there's a totally different economic model and honestly safety concerns when it comes to raising bison, but there's specifically examples like the Ted Turner Ranch, which is a very famous one in the Northern Rockies that's doing just that. And I think it would be wonderful to see more bison ranching to accomplish our climate change needs and reduce human carnivore conflict. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is a really engaging and interesting panel. Just hop on to pilk.org to see our brochure and all the other panels we have coming up the rest of this weekend. Thanks for attending.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.